Well, welcome, everybody. My name is Matthew, and I am a bookseller here at Majors and Quinn, as well as an events operator. I just want to go ahead and extend a very big welcome to everybody here tonight that is choosing to spend the evening with us. For those who don't know, Majors and Quinn is an independent bookstore in Minneapolis, Minnesota. If this is your first time viewing one of our events, we are so happy to have you. And if this is not your first time, welcome back. We appreciate your continued support of our events program, and we sincerely cannot do what we do without your constant support. So thank you for being part of our larger community. This evening, I am so pleased to welcome our guest author, John Saylor, along with our conversation partner, Jeff Forrester, who will be talking about the book, Lakes, Their Birth, Life, and Death. If you're interested in purchasing a copy of the book this evening, you can head to our website, majorsandquinn.com, but I will also be posting a link to the book in the comments once we get rocking and rolling in just a couple of minutes. And speaking of the comments, please, we want to hear from you. Let us know where you're tuning in from. And along the ride, if you have any questions for either of our speakers tonight or about the book itself or any comments, please feel free to submit those in the comments, and we will get to as many as we can. On to introductions. So our author tonight, John Saylor, is a professor of mechanical engineering at Clemson University. He has spent the better part of his career studying fluid mechanics, specifically researching phenomena that occur at the interface between air and water. In addition to lakes, his scientific interests include the physics of drops, bubbles, and waves, and he has applied his research to applications such as the use of water sprays and ultrasonics to clean diesel exhaust and methods for using radar to study raindrops. He was a student at the Santa Fe Science Writing Workshop in 2017. He lives in Clemson, South Carolina. And our conversation partner, Jeff Forrester, has been the executive director of Minnesota Lakes and Rivers for over a decade. Minnesota Lakes and Rivers seeks to protect Minnesota's lake and river heritage for current and future generations by forging powerful links between lake advocates and policy makers. Jeff was Hubert Humphrey Public Policy Fellow and Shannon Leadership Fellow. His book, Forest for the Trees: How Humans Shaped the North Woods, examines fire and forestry in northern Minnesota's Boundary Water Canoe Area Wilderness. He was associate producer of Transplant, A Gift for Life, which won an Emmy. Minnesota Lakes and Rivers has been working to stop the spread of aquatic invasive species in Minnesota since 2009. Jeff lives with his wife, 2 daughters, 2 dogs, and 10 chickens in uptown Minneapolis, but spends much of his time as he can, land adjacent on the Boundary Waters. So, please, everybody, help me in welcoming our 2 speakers tonight, John Saylor and Jeff Forrester.
Thanks, Matthew.
Thanks, Matthew. So, John, this is, well, first, thank you to Majors and Quinn. We actually live about a half a block up the street, but we're doing this Zoom, so I'm in my office. If you are from Minneapolis and have not been to Majors and Quinn, go. If you are coming to town and like to hang out at bookstores, it's a big bookstore with a lot of rare books and maps and first editions and a wonderful children's section. It's a great bookstore. Swing in. And John, so writing a book is such an accomplishment. It's takes a long time. It's very difficult. It's the kind of thing where people ask you what you're doing and you tell them you're writing a book and you don't know what's going to happen with it. So it's sort of socially awkward. I found that when I'm working on a book, I end up talking about it all the time. And so I become a bad dinner companion. So there's a cost, I guess, is what I'm saying. How did you make the decision to to write this book because it's wonderful. I learned so much reading it. It's such a great panoramic view of lakes and all the issues surrounding them. It was really fascinating.
Well, thanks, Jeff. And yeah, I'm a little different from you, actually. When I'm writing a book, I don't talk about it at all because I'm afraid if someone does something bad, I'll just quit and run away and never do it. But to answer your question, how did I come around to writing this book? That's a great question because, of course, I'm a professor of mechanical engineering, and lakes are simply not what most, or I don't know if any, professors of mechanical engineering actually research. Just for fun, I thought I would talk just for a moment about what I do research on most of the time, and that's air-water interfaces, which of course a lake is that, but I tend to focus on the very, very small scale sort of stuff. I'm just going to share my screen for a moment to show you a video of a typical research project that I would be involved in. Hopefully this will work. We tried it before. Okay, so hopefully you all are seeing an odd looking video showing a small drop impacting the water surface. This is what happens when a raindrop hits a lake or an ocean. It creates a splash drop or a lot of splash drops, and those splash drops undergo this kind of final event as they merge and become part of the larger water body. And this is the sort of thing that has a very profound impact on the ability of oceans and lakes to sequester carbon dioxide and things like that. So I only show this, and I'm going to stop sharing now. I only show this to show how kind of different lakes really are from my typical life as a professor. So how this all happened was I did get involved. I have some expertise in how to use satellite data, and I got involved in a project on using satellites to estimate how much water is evaporated out of a lake. So once we did that whole project, one of us had to do the legwork to figure out how to put this in a limnology journal about lakes. And so foolishly, I volunteered to do that. And I had to become a limnologist, I guess, So I was reading some undergraduate textbooks on it. I was reading some pages on the internet and things like that. And, at that time, I liked lakes a lot. I spent 3 years in the Twin Cities when I was getting my master's degree. I've canoed a lot. I think lakes are wonderful. And at that time, that's all I thought they were, pleasant places. Certainly pastoral, certainly relaxing. But what I didn't think was that a lake would be a wondrous, mysterious, even dangerous kind of place. And what my research showed me was all three of those things were true. So lakes were really not these kind of pastoral things, but things that were much, much more exciting and interesting than that. And as I read about some specific lakes, some specific type of lakes and lake events, I kind of got really surprised. And I thought this is kind of a thing that other people might be interested in, find out that a lake is kind of different than what they might have thought it was.
Yeah, I think people often just look at a lake and they see the surface of the water. And the lake is rough or the lake is calm, and there's just so much going on there. And your book goes into such great detail, very readable, very understandable.
That's a great way to put it. One thing I often say when I talk about the book is that as humans, our interaction with lakes are literally superficial, not in a bad way, but in a literal way, right? We swim upon a lake, we boat upon a lake. Even when you look at a lake, you can argue you don't see it. You see the reflection of the sky and the far shore, right? So a lake is almost impossible to see, you can almost argue. And that creates a lot of unknown, which I think kind of explains our love for lakes, but also a sort of a little bit of a fear that's associated with them.
Well, and I know a lot of our members are lake association people, so they're kind of actively engaged in managing lakes. And the chemical processes that you describe in the book in a way that's very easy to understand, and the impact of temperature and pressure and turnover and how that happens and why that happens and when it doesn't happen is just fascinating. Did we lose John? Oh, John's back.
Sorry.
Go ahead.
I think I missed the question there. I'm not really sure what happened, but
I didn't really ask a question. I was just talking about with our folks, work with Lake Association people working to manage lakes. There's so much to them. There's, the chemical processes are really interesting and complex and unusual. The chemistry of water is
that's right.
Fascinating. Your chapter on ice was really interesting. And so as you were researching this, because it wasn't, maybe your milieu, I often kind of feel like I write about things as a way to learn what I think. Right.
Yeah.
And so I discover, as I write. And so what was the discovery that you had where you thought, wow, okay, this was worth the effort,
Right. I think, well, there's several of them, but I think the one that was most motivating in terms of writing the book was probably, my discovery of a kind of lake called the Carolina Bay. So the Carolina Bays, they don't exist in Minnesota. They're found only along the Atlantic coastal plain from southern New Jersey as far down as northern Florida. I live in South Carolina, and they're found in especially great profusion right around the South Carolina and North Carolina border. And the fascinating thing about these lakes is that there's approximately 100,000 of them. They are all, they're perfectly elliptical in shape and outline. And they're all pointed. Their long axis of the ellipse is pointed to the northwest. And, exactly why any of those facts are true is still not really understood. Which is something that, the existence of those lakes was fascinating to me, but also the simple fact that although we've known about them for a while, we don't know how they formed. Hardly at all. I thought that was just, in a world where we seem to know everything, right? We got satellites zipping around other planets, and you'd hear in little old South Carolina, we don't know how these lakes, were formed. And I thought it would be kind of interesting for our viewers to go through the discovery process I did. And so what I'm going to do now is share my screen and go to Google Maps. And I'm going to enter a little town in North Carolina called Elizabethtown, which just happens to be a location where there's a lot of these Carolina Bays. So I very much hope I can do this without losing everybody.
I did that while I was reading the book, by the way.
You did, great.
I got on Google Earth and started looking and was amazed.
Okay, so Jeff, can you see this map here?
I can, yes.
Great. So I'm going to satellite view. Again, this is Elizabethtown, North Carolina. It's along the Cape Fear River, just another little town. And I'm going to pan a little to the right and north. And what hopefully the audience can see is that this landscape is filled with ellipses, with green ellipses. So I'm going to point out explicitly a few. Here's one here, here's one here. Here's one here that has obviously been farmed. Here's another one here. Here's a little one over here, a little one here, a little one here. So these are examples of Carolina Bays. And most of these are green for two reasons. One is that many of them were drained for farming reasons. And the other reason is most of them don't actually have a source. They're ephemeral. So when it rains, they fill. And when it gets dry, they dry out. When they're partially filled with water, they may not be elliptical because of the bathymetry of the bottom. But as you can see here, when they are full, they are elliptically shaped lakes. And if you move around, you pan some more, you just see more and more of these. I mean, they're just, the landscape is simply pockmarked with them. I'm marking some of them. Some of them overlap. Some are inside of the others. Some have whole communities inside of them, farms inside of them, roads running through them. And they're simply everywhere, again, along this Atlantic coastal plain. And when I saw this, I was just, living a few hours away from these things. I was just sort of kind of, I don't know, shocked and surprised and really bitten by the bug. I just couldn't believe there was something like this right here in plain sight. And we don't understand the formation mechanism for those. I mean, there have been various theories proposed, some fairly controversial, which I talk about in the book, others kind of standard geological formation mechanisms, but none of them can explain what you actually see on the ground with regard to these lakes. So that was, a big discovery. Again, the Carolina Bays in and of themselves, but also the simple fact that, something like a lake type, we still don't know where they came from, anything about them. And they're pretty interesting in other ways too, ecologically. If you read about biologists who study these, they often speak of each Carolina Bay having like kind of a slightly different ecosystem from the next. That the little rim that defines each of them is sort of a place where amphibians and other wildlife, they kind of don't venture out of. So these bays are very, very important for amphibians because they tend to drain, which kills fish, which are the primary predator of these amphibians. And so once they're there, they're pretty happy, and they kind of stay there for a while and sort of have a parallel evolution. In fact, one of the largest Carolina bays is called Lake Wakama, and it is home to 3, I believe they're freshwater mussels that are found simply nowhere else on Earth. They're only found in that one lake, and it's just this micro ecosystem that's very important for several types of wildlife, including the Venus flytrap.
Yeah, that was a really interesting section. And I got on Google and saw the same thing, and I was like, oh my God.
Yeah.
It's crazy when you start looking at it. Well, and then, what was in your mind, what was kind of the most difficult lake or aspect of lakes in general to write about?
One that was really challenging, but also really fascinating is a kind of lake called a subglacial lake.
Yeah.
And, as soon as I learned about them, I knew I had to put subglacial lakes in the book. So a subglacial lake, they exist in Antarctica. So these are lakes very different from the ones you and I interact with, nearby you, Lake of the Isles or whatever, has an air-water interface, right? So the top of the lake is air. Subglacial lakes have a rocky bottom, which is the Antarctic continental bedrock, but its surface is ice. So the top of the lake is a liquid ice interface, not an air-water interface. And that sheet of ice varies, but it's on the order of 2 miles. So these lakes are incredible in that they're enormous. Some of them are as large as Lake Ontario. There are hundreds of them. And the water in the lake has literally not seen the light of day for at least 100,000 years, and by some estimates, maybe 10 million years. So the water and the life, presumably in those lakes, has undergone, I talked about ecosystems before, but here they have the organisms there have truly undergone a path of evolution that parallels the evolution that's occurred up here on the surface, right? So there is no interaction between these subglacial lakes in Antarctica and the atmosphere, right? So they are completely on their own and have been for perhaps millions of years. And that whole idea has always just blown me away to think that here on Earth, there's this place where, life, however it may exist down there, has evolved, on a parallel track. So that just fascinated me. But you asked me what was the hardest part to write about. The hardest part to write about was to explain the existence of these lakes. You have to understand and then communicate some really difficult ice physics. Each of these lakes has a very interesting surface. They're all tilted. And that's due to the hydrostatic or ice hydrostatic pressure equilibria, which took me a long time to sort of get it in my head to the point where I understood it. And then I had to get it in my head to the point where I understood it well to write about it. Hopefully I did. Hopefully I succeeded, but it's kind of complicated to do. And I might have uttered a few curse words while writing that chapter.
Well, and to get the picture of a lake that isn't flat, it's on an angle, and how that worked was really, I had to stop and think, and then I kind of started to get it. So, I mean, I understand why now, but it's still a really unusual concept.
It is.
So what did they find when they've drilled down to these lakes now, right?
Right. So that by itself was a whole saga, and books have been written about it. This was probably the most well studied. There's been 3 lakes that have been studied fairly well, but the most well studied one is called Lake Vostok. I think it's the largest one found to date. It's the one that's about the same size as Lake Ontario. And the Russians primarily have studied it, and they drilled for years and years. And as you can imagine, you're working. Lake Vostok is where the coldest temperature on planet Earth has ever been recorded. So this is a very, very difficult environment to work in. And I think it took him a total of 12 years to actually make it through, break through, and get a sample of water. Now, the water that they've obtained solely contains bacteria and other microscopic life forms. And they're still trying to understand the similarity and differences between those and the ones that would exist up here where you and I live. But the really, a fascinating thing about the life down there is that its ultimate source, it's all, at the end of the day, it has to be primarily chemosynthetic, right? So up on the surface, you and I exist regardless of our diet. We exist because of photosynthesis, right? So we may eat steak or chicken or whatever, but the things that we eat either are plants or themselves feed on plants, which is another way of saying all of our carbon was once CO2 that was fixed to a plant via the photosynthesis reaction, the most important reaction, for life on Earth, except if you're in Lake Vostok. So there, you're 2 miles beneath the ice, 0 light makes its way down there. So this is truly a completely black, dark environment. And so the main source of life, the thing that other life forms feed on, by definition have to be chemosynthetic organisms that use the chemical energy released by breaking bonds in chemicals to form energy, to form biomass that ultimately can feed other things. Now, exactly what all might exist there is still, this is all still early days. One thing they're very interested in doing is trying to get to the sediments at the bottom, because that's where there's a lot of history, all the deposition millennia after millennia. And that's going to be a challenge because you have to go through the hole, release a robot, have the robot fall down, have the robot drill, get a sample, and somehow radio it back up. And this is why, in fact, NASA is very interested in Lake Vostok, because they want to do the same thing on a moon of Jupiter, I believe, called Europa, which is thought to have massive amounts of water, actually, perhaps salt water, but it's all under ice. So for them to get to the water and see if there's life on Europa that's at all like life here, they're going to have to do the same thing that they're going to do at Lake Vostok. Drill through it and have a robot descend from the bottom of the ice sheet to the sediment, collect a sample, and somehow get either the sample or information of the sample back up through the ice sheet to the surface. So it's a really exciting time, I think, to think about these kinds of ways.
You touched on photosynthesis, and it was, we think of lakes as this, a hole filled with water. But because of photosynthesis and the exchange of oxygen and carbon dioxide at the surface, I began to see them as kind of living entities, and your title implies this. I thought that was a really fascinating idea, that the lakes themselves are born, have a life, and then die.
Yeah.
Do you want to talk kind of about those phases of lakes a little bit?
Sure. I think first I'd like to talk about, because, I'm a professor of mechanical engineering. So for years and years and years, I've read, obviously, mechanical engineering textbooks, and they have a certain flavor to them. But boy, when I started reading limnology textbooks, it was a real kind of breath of fresh air. I mean, I think in the biological fields, people are a little bit more lyrical, even in textbook writing. And I remember reading about in a limnology textbook. I remember reading about a lake turnover, right? So this is the process, Jeff, as you know, where every autumn, the surface of the lake that has been warm all summer is getting cooled. That cooled surface gets heavier and heavier. During the summer, the lake is stratified, so the cold water is at the bottom and the hot water is at the top, and oxygen has a great deal of difficulty getting to the bottom because the surface is where the oxygen is, and how does that surface water get to the bottom? And it only does so by overturning. So again, in the fall, that surface water gets cold, and eventually it gets cold and heavy enough that it goes to the bottom and the entire lake overturns. And limnologists tend to wax poetic about this event, because this is the one moment where the lake becomes fully oxygenated. And, limnologists talk about a lake often as an entity that, unlike you and I who breathe, a few times per minute, it breathes once or twice a year, right? Every year it gets two breaths, one in the fall, and one in the spring. And I remember thinking that image was so accurate, but also so kind of, I don't know, lyrical and romantic. I really liked it. But yeah, and that got me thinking about, the very fact that, and I'm not the first to point this out, but lakes do go through a life cycle. Many people have referenced the fact that the very thing that enables a lake to be a lake, the fact that it's generally a basin that collects water, that feature is exactly what dooms it. So the fact that water runs into it also means that sediment runs into it, right? So it's impossible to have, a lake that gets its source of water from runoff or from streams or from rivers without it also having quantities of suspended matter, sand, organic detritus, all sorts of things. You cannot not have that. And that, of course, settles out. And millimeter by millimeter, year by year, that sediment accrues, and the basin gets shallower and shallower and undergoes what is often referred to as senescence as it goes from a deep lake to a shallow lake to a smaller lake to a swamp, and eventually just to a stream that runs through it. Now that process can be really slow, and I think there was a point in time where limnologists sort of thought of that as like the path of all lakes, which isn't the case. I mean, lakes can be birthed and die in many different ways. For example, deep lakes they will never die in that way. So if we look at like Lake Baikal, which is the deepest lake on Earth, it's certainly true that sediment is accruing in its bottom, but it is so deep that it is literally going to be the case that we will undergo a next ice age before that lake fills in, right? So that brings us to the other really important thing about lakes, both in terms of their birth and their death, is ice ages. So 90% of the lakes on Earth are formed by glaciers, and some lakes are just remodeled by glaciers. So the Great Lakes have always kind of existed as far back as the geological record permits us to look, but it's been modified by glaciers in the past. So small lakes can die via this senescence, this buildup of sediment. whereas the deeper, larger lakes may simply be destroyed by the next ice age or modified in their shape or form as time passes.
Well, and you talk about kind of like geological events to like form lakes or end lakes, like, you know, tectonics and glaciers and so forth, but then also human activity. So kind of for the first time in history, we're another player in this, in creating and ending lakes.
That's it. Yeah, that's a great way of saying it. We are. That's exactly it. We're a player now, right? So we're prodigious lake builders. You know, you don't have to travel very far to see a human-made lake. Where I live, most of the lakes around me are actually lakes that were dammed up to prevent flooding, either by the Army Corps of Engineers or sometimes by power companies. So we're very prolific in making lakes, particularly in making small lakes. And that process is ongoing. So if you look at the developing world, you know, as soon as areas become subject to mechanized agriculture, one of the first things you do is dam up a little spring or river so that you can have livestock or you have irrigation water for the dry times. And we human beings have been doing that for a really long time. There's evidence in the Middle East of dams that were built, you know, 1,000 years before the time of Christ, if not further back in time. Mm-hmm. So it seems like as soon as we human beings kind of stopped being wanderers and decided, okay, we know how to plant crops and survive. Right around then, that's right when we also said, let's dam up that little stream over there. There's dams in Europe, in Spain, that were built during the Roman Empire that are still used today. So yeah, if you think of lakes as inherently good, we humans do some good because we build a lot of lakes. I'm not sure everyone would agree with that, but we definitely do that. But to use your phrase again, Jeff, of us being players, we also destroy lakes, and even enormous lakes. So one of the largest natural disasters ever to occur is called the Aral Sea Disaster. So the Aral Sea is actually a lake. It exists on the border between Uzbekistan and Kazakhstan. And before the 1960s, it was the fourth largest lake, I think, by area on Earth. It's simply, you know, enormous. And in the 1960s, the Soviets initiated a large irrigation project to primarily, I believe, plant fiber crops, cotton, along the shores of the Aral Sea. And so the sources of the Aral Sea's water were diverted for agriculture. So all kinds of irrigation systems were built, developed, and, you know, this desert, you know, bloomed as these irrigation projects flourished. But those irrigation projects used enormous quantities of water, and you know, the Soviets were so successful in this project that they reduced the size of the Aral Sea to 10% of its former self. So this was a massive, dramatic desiccation of one of the largest lakes in the world, simply to water fields, to irrigate fields. And the consequences of that were really quite bad. So there's a great article in National Geographic about you know, a journalist who went to visit, you know, the Aral Sea, and he describes, you know, there's photographs too. He describes what it's like to start at the shore of where the sea used to be, to get in a Jeep, to travel at 60 miles an hour to the new shore, the whole while, and for it to take an hour to do that, that's 60 miles an hour. And the whole time knowing that as you're driving, water was once 10 meters above your head.
Yeah.
Right. So this enormous salt flat. So the Aral Sea was a mildly saline lake. And so when it was desiccated, it left salt in dried out lake bottom. where of course nothing would grow. So great sandstorms would pick up all of this alkali and this salt, causing incredible respiratory problems among the surrounding population, which were exacerbated by the fact that this was an irrigation project. So there was pesticide application, herbicide application, which all ran into the lake. Something, Jeff, I know you know an awful lot about.
Yeah.
And when that water evaporated, all those pesticides and herbicides deposited on the dry lake floor, and that was part of the detritus blown into the air during these dust storms. And it's just an incredible lesson. I hope we all learn from it, because we've seen that in the United States with Owens Lake in California. The Owens River was diverted, I think, in the 1930s for Los Angeles water, and the same thing happened there. The same thing is currently happening right now in our Great Salt Lake. So Salt Lake City and its surrounding communities are growing by leaps and bounds, and the need for water is growing accordingly. So the fresh water that runs into that lake is being diverted for human uses, and the shores of that lake are receding as well. And the same issue, confronts us there as that shoreline gets farther and farther away. The potential for dust storms and respiratory problems among the population grows there. And the thing I think about a lot is that for a very, very long time, there have been all these wacky proposals of, hey, we've got the Great Lakes. Up there we got the Great Lakes, not a whole lot of people living around them. But in Phoenix and Los Angeles and San Diego and Tucson, we've got, people moving there every day. Let's have the water move to where the people are. Hopefully that will never happen. I don't think it will, because we have the Great Lakes Compact with Canada forbids that sort of thing. But for people who think that, wow, the Great Lakes are so big, we could just take water away and port it to LA or something, and there wouldn't be any real consequences. The Aral Sea Disaster shows you that just isn't true. The thirst of human beings is enormous, and drying out a Great Lake is a possible thing if you're not careful.
Well, how long did it take with the RLC? Like 40 years, right?
It did. It took, but it was an ongoing process. It kept getting. It must have been excruciating for the local population, because the salinity just kept going up and up and up, and there was a very vibrant fishery all around that enormous sea. And bit by bit, these species of fish sort of tried to evolve as the salinity went up. And of course, it was changing too quickly. So the fishery died off. A lot of awful things happened. There was an island in the middle of that the Soviets used to test biological weapons. They tested everything there. It was just crazy. And I guess they thought, well, this is the safest place to do it. It's in the middle of this enormous salt lake. No one's ever going to be able to get here. And that island now is not an island. It's just connected to the mainland.
Right. Yeah. And there's still proposals to pump water from aquifers in the Midwest to the West and the Mississippi River. And we've got a lot of lakes here in Minnesota. So, the idea of moving water around has a great deal of risk attached to it. It not a simple thing.
It does. I think, as I understand it, a kind of rule of thumb among, water resource managers, and probably the one that's most violated is you should never move water from one basin to the next. Right? Because if you keep the water in the basin, it's biological character for everything from bacteria up to fish stays in that basin, and you don't introduce a type of bacteria or a species from one basin to the next. It's such a wise idea, if only we followed it.
Yeah. Well, and you touched on one thing that I hadn't really thought of. Here we are creating all these lakes. So some lakes have gone away, but we're creating a lot of lakes. Right. And the evaporation from these lakes is significant. And and I know you look at evaporation somewhat, and you kind of touched on the idea that, what are the impacts to climate? Are we supercharging our climate with moisture? What? And have you followed up on this at all? Do you have any other ideas on what the impacts might be?
Well, I mean, that gets a little farther from my wheelhouse, but it's just a fascinating thing to think about. I put one statistic in the book, which is kind of a small statistic. The point is that we have dammed up so much water that, the partition of water on Earth is now larger on the freshwater side than it was before humans started building dams, right? So by building dams, evaporation notwithstanding, more of water that normally would be in the sea is now in lakes. And as a consequence of that, so everyone talks about sea level rise, which of course exists, but because of all of this holding on to water as fresh water in impoundments and lakes, the rise in sea level has actually been diminished by about like 1 or 2 millimeters.
Really?
Yeah, which is a small number, right? I mean, you're talking about, the depth of the ocean, and we're talking about 1 or 2 millimeters. But still, it kind of, I don't know, it's a number that surprises me that we have been so good at keeping fresh water from flowing to the sea that as climate change progresses, the amount of rise of sea level is actually a little less than it would have otherwise been. I'm not sure if that's a good news or a bad news story, but it's certainly testament to how good we are or how much we have done that. And the other probably more dire way to look at that is that we when we build a lake, we're of course always building it in a watershed. So basically, we're damming up a river. And when you do that enough, you no longer have a river. And that's something that's, has occurred already in several very, very large rivers. So the most, written about example of that would be the Colorado River, right? So we have dams all along the Colorado River. We extract water from the Colorado River all the way from its very start to where it exits into the Bay of California in Baja. And we've retained so much of that water that, where the Colorado River once flew out in a mighty torrent, right? It's an incredibly large river system. It now barely flows out at all. There's almost no flow, or in some points in time when it's very dry, there's zero flow at all. So it's not, it's not really a river, at least in the sense that a river should probably end up in the ocean, right? This river, the Colorado River, simply does not. And I know you're director of Minnesota Lakes and Rivers, so this is how these things are. One example, of course, how these are coupled, right? Okay, you make lakes and you have more of them, but now the whitewater environment, the rapid flowing environment, the constantly raising and lowering water environment that certain ecosystems depend on critically, that simply doesn't exist anymore. I live in the Savannah River watershed, and the Savannah empties into the Atlantic at Savannah, Georgia. And, historical records show that, you would get, in that area, during flood, you would have enormous swaths of land that would be underwater. You'd have white water. You'd have, flow rates of 100,000 cubic feet per second flowing into that, completely submerging in, miles and miles and miles of tidal area, which was imperatively, very, very important for certain types of life. And that simply doesn't happen anymore, right? We don't tolerate that, because that means all of our housing, and people die and everything like that. So we can't allow it to happen. And that's the ecological downside, is you have whole ecosystems, riverine ecosystems that depend on very violent, rapidly changing water levels. They just sort of have disappeared.
So if there was one takeaway from the book, what would you think? I mean, what's the key piece?
I think the key piece is that lakes are magic, and all the more so because they don't look that way. Personally, there's nothing I love more than a secret hidden in plain sight. I just love that. This is a little off topic, but I went for a hike a while back near me in a wildlife reserve, and while I was there, I was reading the signage. This is a really neat little wildlife reserve. It's a little bit of a gorge with a tremendous waterfall. Very, very, very wet environment, even wet for South Carolina. And there is a fern that exists in 3 places: in England, in Haiti, and in that reserve.
Wow.
Yeah. So I thought that was just wild, and especially since it's like 45 minutes from my home. And I thought, wow, that's kind of like a secret hidden in plain sight. And lakes are all about that, right? I mean, you have these things like Carolina Bays, like Lake Vostok. You have, I talk in the book about a lake called Lake Nyos in Cameroon that in the local dialect, Lake Nyos means the good lake. But there was a secret hidden plain sight there, kind of an evil secret. And that good lake was a lake that whose bottom water was saturated in carbon dioxide. And that carbon dioxide built up year after year after year. This was a crater lake actually above the towns on a dormant volcano that the towns were below. And on August 21st of 1986, there was an underwater landslide, and that caused some of this water saturated in carbon dioxide from vents in the floor to move upward. And when it moved upward, the pressure dropped in the same way the pressure drops when you open a can of soda. And bubbles came out of solution, and those bubbles rose up, and they entrained more bottom water behind them. That water was saturated in CO2, and more carbon dioxide came out of solution in bubbles. So this fed back upon itself. And within very, very short period of time, there was basically what's called a limnic explosion, and 1/4 of a cubic mile of CO2 was released. That was very cold carbon dioxide and very heavy, and it raced down the hillside, and it killed 1,746 people in their sleep, along with thousands of head of cattle. It's a horrible, horrible disaster. But Time wrote about it, and they called it the Killer Lake. So that's not a very pleasant secret, but to go from a lake that the locals call a good lake to a lake that's now referred to as the Killer Lake shows nothing other than the fact that lakes can be very secret.
You're right, and everybody's dead, and there's no disturbance. There's no fire. There's no signs of violence. They're just gone.
That's right.
It was a really spooky section. Well, I guess I'm trying to look here and see if there's any questions that people have.
Yeah, it'd be great. Hear what folks are thinking. Yeah, that when I read some articles about a lot of scientists from all over the world flew right away out to that lake after Lake Nyos after that event. And I remember one scientist, she wrote about it, and she said the thing that struck her most was that it was quiet.
Yeah.
This is equatorial Africa. I mean, there should be, an insect cacophony, there.
Right.
This was in August. And it was just utterly quiet because everything that consumes oxygen had died. So the insects, the mice, rats, birds, everything was dead. And so the area was silent for days until birds of prey from nearby regions began to fly into the area.
Yeah, it's amazing. That was a really kind of scary section of the book. Are you when you were here in Minnesota? we have kind of these glacial basin lakes up north, and then you know, a lot of different kinds of lakes in Minnesota. With a changing climate, we're getting 2+ inches of rain a year more than we have gotten in the past historically. Coming in cloudburst events, changing hydrology in the area. Any ideas casting ahead as to what kind of changes we might see in lakes with warmer water, different ice in, ice out, more flowing water over the surface of the...
Right. Well, I mean, the thing that comes to mind, and this is not not super bad, positive thought, but the geological record suggests that I don't know how many millions of years back this was, back when our climate was very rich in CO2 due to natural reasons. There's evidence that as far north as like Baffin Island, there were plants living then that really today only exist, in the southern United States. That the climate became so temperate and so wet that they were, living up there. I don't know what is going to happen. I'm thinking that things will instead of it being a trend of wetter and wetter in Minnesota, it just seems that more often what we see is more extremes, that you see like just really, really wet years and then extremely, dry years. So what I'm wondering is if what you might see more of in northern Minnesota is periods where the lakes are extremely high, followed by periods where the lakes are quite low, and a stress on organisms that suffer in those changes, and a growth in life forms, and from fish to mammals to insects that kind of thrive with that change. That's kind of the optimistic point of view I want to take, is that that evolution can act fast enough. Not so much that we will favor species that like it warmer or like it wetter, but that we will favor species that are robust, that they can handle, more of the extremes. I think about a species that exists in what are called the playas of like the Texas Panhandle and up through the Ogallala aquifer area. And there's a spadefoot toad that exists there, right? So these playas are water basins that are very ephemeral, right? So you get a rainstorm and maybe they're wet for 4 weeks or something like that, and then they may be dry for like a year or a year and a half. And the spadefoot toad has evolved to survive in the system. They will, they will go down in the mud and stay there sometimes for a year. They have this, utterly compressed life cycle, right? The moment that in fact, they've shown that the moment that they hear thunder, they start wriggling up out of that mud, because as soon as it gets wet, they've got to find a mate. They've got a mate. The eggs have to hatch. They have to survive, grow a bit, and then go back down again. And I don't know. The optimist in me hopes that as climate change makes things more radical, that there are life forms that will accommodate to that craziness. I don't know.
Tristan Tabor, forgive me if I pronounced it wrong, asked, in Maine and Minnesota, part of the protection to lakes has been late ice cover. What are your thoughts regarding the shifting climate with lakes and ice cover?
So I guess it's sort of a similar, question.
This kind of gets more to that overturn and the chemistry, the chemical composition of the lakes.
Right. Well, so if you don't get that overturn, you still can get the autumnal overturn if you don't get the the spring overturn. So even with changes in ice cover, that overturn would continue to occur. Again, I guess to be an optimist, you can make the point that if things go the other way, right, where the climate gets much colder, as the average temperature gets lower and lower and lower, the size of the lake at which you get complete freezing can get bigger and bigger, right? So if you have a lake that's a foot deep, if you can call that a lake, it can freeze solid, in which case you don't really have a chance for there to be any fish life in it. If the average temperature gets lower and lower and lower during the winter, the size of the lake where that devastating event can occur gets progressively larger. So again, if you wanted to be an optimist, you could say that some of these lakes are actually being protected by the temperature not going the other way, by getting a little warmer. I don't know. One thing I do like to make the point about regarding just water systems in general is that it's very wise of us to be concerned about any and all changes in the environment that we as humans are imparting upon ecosystems. Mm-hmm. But it's also important, and Jeff, I think I was reading this in an article that you wrote recently. Before the 1970s, which wasn't all that long ago,
I remember.
I remember too. Yeah, so things were far worse. The Clean Water Act was an incredible thing that we as a society did, and I look around where I live, and the quality of the water is very good. It's been a long time since there's been DDT in the environment. The birds of prey around me are just every year that the population density seems to go up. So we have to be careful. We have to be aware of what we've done. But I always like to have a positive note, because at the end of the day, all of this is about human behavior. And if all it is bad news, and all it is things we got to do that are incredibly hard to do, people just give up. And the point I would like to make is that we've had some real success stories. I mean, we in this country, we've done incredible things in terms of turning around ecosystems with the Clean Water Act and many other pieces of legislation. So I think it's good to point out the threats that exist, but the fact that we as humans have a chance to make things better, and we've done that within our at least within our lifetimes.
Yeah, I agree, and it's a lot of personal decisions can make a big, we've been working on shoreline restoration and so forth, and there's this idea that a pound of phosphorus in a lake can produce 500 pounds of algae in the lake. So one person can have a big impact on algae blooms in lakes, just by preventing water from flowing over the carrying phosphorus from the soils into the water by planting a buffer zone.
And just to add on to that, Jeff, that's such a wise strategy to make that point, because more often than we always want to think about saving the environment as something that's going to be unpleasant. We're going to have to give something up, right, to make things better. But nobody wants an algae-filled lake, right?
Right.
So these are examples where the aesthetics of it all, the value of your home, the aesthetics of it, what you want to have happen, and what the ecosystem wants are all co-aligned. It's all of a piece, and that's a wonderful thing, a wonderful message to get out there.
Well, and the solution is wildflowers. So it's kind of beautiful,
That's right, absolutely.
So it's sort of a win-win. Tristan writes, if we are seeing shifty geometrics to the lakeshore due to the variability which you posit, do you think this will change the mechanical nature of shorelines, erosions, and wave action?
Yeah, sure. So, when you have more, particularly for larger lakes, when you have more violent storms, you have more wave action. And this can have a profound impact on on lake geometry. So the well-known mechanism of when the wind is flowing in one direction, you have an elongation of the lake in basically the perpendicular direction due to maximal wave erosion in those off wind directions. That definitely has an impact. That's usually understood within the context of northern lakes where you have permafrost, and the erosion, of course, is they're much more vulnerable to erosion, and you can have the development of the geometries that way. So yes, that definitely can happen. I'm not sure how much that would impact an ecosystem, right? So not so clear to me that ecosystems require a certain geometry in the lake in terms of its footprint. But that is definitely something that can happen.
Yeah.
All right. Well, the time is now 8:01 p.m. So that pretty much does it for tonight. I just want to go ahead and thank John and Jeff for joining us this evening, and for everybody that has tuned in. Thank you again for being part of our Majors and Quinn community. And is there anything that you two would like to play off with?
I just say thank you to Majors and Quinn, and visit your local bookstore. They are just an important part of the life of the mind in our country.
And thank you, Matt, to Majors and Quinn for coming up with this format and being such a great bookstore and part of the city. And John, this was a really really wonderful book, and I really enjoyed reading it and learned so much. And thank you for taking the time and writing this, because I think it's an important book, and it's a pleasure to read.
Thanks, Jeff, and thanks for all you do at Minnesota Lakes and Rivers. I mean, that's really kind of a incredible organization. Appreciate that.
Thank you.
All right. Well, everyone have a fantastic evening, and we will see you next time. Have a good night, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thank you all.
Thank you.